Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, January 18th, day 835 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, always a pleasure to see you, and I think you brought a prop today to the
I
record.
did. Well, good morning, Shavua Tov. Go Pats, cheering for you tonight. If you're from Houston, then I don't want to hear from you, but we're going to the Super Bowl again this year. Heard it here first.
Fantastic. But seriously, we have a lot to discuss. An Iranian official has said that the death toll of the protests that have been sparked throughout the country since December 28th could be as high as 5,000. We're hearing other numbers, and Laser will clue us into what we know is going on the ground right now. We'll also hear what U.S. President Donald Trump has to say over the past several days over what's going on in Iran. And even as a low boil of fighting continues in Gaza, a slew of names were appointed to the executive board of the Board of Peace. So we're going to hear Israel's reaction to this and a few of the names as well. And then to finish off with, we'll turn to Syria and see what's going on Israel's northern border as the president of Syria is set to take a trip to Germany this week. So all of this and more when we're back.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. So, whereas an Iranian official has put the death toll to some 5,000, stitching together some doctors' testimonies out of Iran, the Sunday Times out of England has put the number as high as 16,500. Most of the dead were people under the age of 30, and that at least 330,000 people have been injured in the protests since December 28th. So, Laser, we're hearing conflicting reports whether they're still going on at all. So, what do you know about what's happening in Iran?
You're right. We don't know much because the internet blackout persists. There is some connectivity through Starlink, some ability for groups like this doctors group to speak to international media. But in general, it's not clear what the picture is. The trend seems to be that over the weekend, as we predicted here when we were discussing on Friday, that the security services in Iran would be able to kill, intimidate, arrest, injure enough protesters to get them out of the streets. And it seems like the peak of these protests are behind us. So anyone who is hoping that this would be the trigger to the downfall of the regime, as has been the case in previous protests, some which were larger, this was not the case. That doesn't mean the regime is at all steady. It means this particular round they managed to get through, but that doesn't mean that they are able to address any of the deeper anger and concerns that Iranians have. I'll just make a point. So we don't know how many Iranians were killed. We probably will never know. But if you look at the scale of the numbers, it's thousands. It seems clear, up to 16,000 and 300,000 injured. And if you remember, even early in the Gaza war, what the international reaction was when you had far lower numbers in a actual war that Israel was attacked, and a high percentage of which were Hamas fighters and other combatants. And you look at the international reaction and statements by world leaders and encampments and marches in the streets of Western capitals. Compare it to the silence here. I think that is telling about some of the moral compass of a lot of these players who were shaking their fingers and worse at Israel over the past 2 years.
Okay, definitely there is some hypocrisy going on, but there have been international protests throughout the world, or rallies at least, for the fall of the regime, but also for this in support of the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
By Iranians and their allies, not by the same people who were. You don't see mass student protests or Europeans who are taken to the streets in mass numbers like they did for the Palestinians.
I hear what you're saying. And indeed, inside Iran, as I mentioned, it does appear that it's mostly the youth that are being slaughtered here. So this is a really terrible situation, no doubt. But what's confusing to me, Lazar, even as the regime appears to not be toppling, US President Donald Trump said yesterday it's time to look for new leadership in Iran. And that comes, at the what could potentially be the tail end of these protests. So, what do you make of that?
I think everyone's trying to figure out what Trump is going to do and hanging on every interview and every kind of indication every time he speaks to the press. It's not clear that Trump knows what Trump wants to do. If reports over the weekend are correct, he was about to order a strike, and then old friend Witkoff got a message directly from Iran's foreign minister that they're not going to execute hundreds of protesters, and that was enough for Trump to at least hold off. Of course, he had said earlier that if protesters are killed, then he would get involved, or that there would be that the regime would pay a very significant price. But he wasn't saying only through hanging. They've obviously been killing people on the street, so I'm not sure that that his threat should have been, according to his own criteria, that would be enough to call back his threat. So it seems like on other issues, in the past, we've seen Trump changing direction quickly, not exactly clear what he wants to do, making decisions based on who he spoke to last. Obviously, we see Witkoff being a decisive figure, not an experienced diplomat. And we've seen him around some of the situations in Gaza and some of the statements he made there, that there is reason not to be exactly thrilled with Witkoff being the leading decision maker. It seems like a lot of the more sober and serious American officials were actually expecting an attack. There's also the question of what Israel has been telling the U.S. There are reports, I believe it was the Washington Post this morning, that said that Israel actually said, we're not ready. We would like to have more U.S. assets in the area to combat a potential Iranian attack. I don't know. I haven't seen any Israeli confirmation, haven't heard any myself. So it's hard to imagine that Israel is indeed calling off an American strike on Iran. But let's also keep in mind let's remember that before the 12-day war, there was a massive deception campaign, kind of calming things down, showing this split between the U.S. and Israel. We have to keep that in mind as well, that's always a possibility, but not necessarily. But let's just see everything through that potential lens as well.
Right, the 12-day war in June, you called Witkoff inexperienced in terms of diplomacy, though I would argue that within the past year, he's had more experience than most career diplomats in terms of speaking with leaders around the globe. But be that as it may, Lazar, one of the other interesting points that I'm hearing out of Iran and coming from an unnamed Iranian official that was sourced by Reuters is that many of the dead come from the Kurdish areas in Iran. So I don't know if this is some kind of scapegoating in a way, meaning the Kurds of Iran, are they kind of the Jews of the world? I don't know if you can put in that kind of language, but pointing to the Kurdish sector of the population, what do you see? What is the reasoning behind this, or could it actually be accurate?
We doubt that it's accurate because we saw the massive protests in Tehran, in the major cities, which are not majority Kurdish in any way. The Kurdish areas up in the northwest and is not is not where the big cities are. So yeah, it seems to be a part of the narrative that the government has been trying to push, which is that these are outside sponsored. The Kurds are always seen as potential U.S. and of course Israeli agents. And that fits in very neatly to the attempts to portray this as some sort of outside, non-Iranian intervention that the regime is merely defending itself against.
Okay, Lisa, let's go to a short break and then we'll discuss Gaza and Syria.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. The IDF and the Shin Bet yesterday revealed the identities of several Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives who were killed in strikes in the Gaza Strip earlier in the week. Israel claims that these strikes were carried out in response to, quote, blatant violations of the ceasefire. So among those killed are some pretty big baddies, and we may talk about them in a second. But Lazar, I think it's important to emphasize that the Gaza Strip is not some kind of peaceful utopia at this point, which obviously nobody considers it would be with Hamas in control, but that there is some kind of tit-for-tat fighting continuing.
Yeah, that's been going on for the past several months. The Israeli attempt is to turn this into a reality that mirrors what's going on in Lebanon, where there is a ceasefire that cements the victory that Israel attained on the battlefield, and Israel is free to enforce that in regular strikes against its enemy, so long as it doesn't agree to disarm and fully implement the surrender document that it agreed to. But in both cases, it's been extremely problematic. We've spoken about Lebanon and the desire of the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, but they don't have the power to do so, and the threat of opening war, the reopening of war in the north. And then in Gaza, it seems like Hamas assesses that it has survived the Israeli offensive with these diplomatic advances, including this board of peace and executive board that are being announced, that there are more and more layers keeping from Israel renewing the war. I'm sure that Israel feels some of that pressure as well, and they are trying to achieve what they can beforehand, but also make clear that we are not going to stop defending ourselves. So, a lot of uncertainty in the Gaza Strip, and by no means is Hamas down and out. They're still armed, there's still thousands of fighters, and they still control the vast majority of Gazans, meaning that some elements of the reality in Gaza mirror October 6th, in that there is a line which we're not supposed to cross, we occasionally do cross. There's tit-for-tat violence, as you call it, and the majority of Gazans are controlled by the Hamas terror group.
So Israel has been very clear throughout the war that it will come after any kind of Hamas operative anytime, anywhere. And so even during the ceasefire, do you feel like it's taking this it's disregarding the idea of a ceasefire and still attacking, still striking those Hamas or other terrorist organization operatives who did commit atrocities against Israelis? And is this actually a violation of the ceasefire?
So a ceasefire is not the end goal. A ceasefire cements. Well, why did Israel agree to a ceasefire? And why did Hamas agree to a ceasefire? Hamas was granted a stop from Israel's military offensive only if they would agree to the terms that Israel demanded, right? That they would agree to release all the hostages and to disarm. So Israel said we could achieve the victory through war, but if we can achieve it without war, then we'll stop firing. That's fine. Since that has not been a very smooth process, especially on the latter, on the disarmament of Hamas and removing them from power, the whole logic of the ceasefire starts to crumble. You get in a ceasefire what you achieved on the battlefield. So if Hamas is going to insist that the ceasefire protects it from any attacks from now on, I would say that Israel would be well served to start, saying then the very logic of the ceasefire doesn't hold anymore. The ceasefire is supposed to cement our victory, not allow Hamas to get out of being defeated and to even claim victory itself. So this is not a real estate deal. This is the only thing that stopped the war for Hamas. Obviously, Hamas is going to present it as a violation. So are its allies in the international sphere. That is Turkey and Qatar, two countries which are going to have very senior representation on this executive board, something that is very problematic for Israel. there is a real danger that Israel's achievements on the battlefield are will be squandered because of the makeup, and we'll have to see. But what this executive board does, it seems like there's a real possibility that Israel is going to lose a lot of its veto power and a lot of its decision-making power if it's one country among a dozen that are making decisions on the future of Gaza.
Okay, our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid tomorrow will delve into what this executive board is, but broadly speaking, the inclusion of Qatar and Turkey is terrible in terms of the perspective of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And has he issued any kind of statements to that effect so far?
Yeah, well, so Turkey is the really the worst one because, of course, Qatar, Israel has been open to doing all sorts of deals with it, the extent of which are not fully known, it seems, but also having them as one of the key mediators, if not the key mediator, on the hostage issue throughout the war. Um, Netanyahu's office, shortly after Shabbat ended last night, put out a statement, which was very rare because, as far as I can remember, in the 1 year that Trump has been in office, this is the most direct statement disagreeing with a Trump decision, saying that we do not approve of the makeup of the executive board of the Board of Peace, which is the most powerful, most meaningful of the bodies there. And this came out in Hebrew, not in English. Well, later it came out in English, but it was not one of the English-only ones that was designed for an American audience. And very curiously, it said that Netanyahu will be sending Foreign Minister Gideon Sar to talk to Secretary of State Marco Rubio about this. Gideon Sar has not been involved in anything having to do with policy toward the White House until now. He's been frozen out by Ron Dermer and by Netanyahu. Of course, Dermer's not there anymore, but it doesn't mean Sar is going to get that file. Now it sits with the U.S. Ambassador, Yechiel Leiter. So the question is, why is Trump talking about Sar is going to have a phone call with Rubio instead of Trump talking to Netanyahu, or Netanyahu talking to Trump on this? It could be that he's setting up Sar for failure so we could blame him for this not working. It could be that Netanyahu is simply has to put something out to speak to his base and to prepare himself for elections, and there's he's told Trump that he was going to do that. But it's very curious, and it certainly doesn't seem to be going in a direction that is especially optimistic for Israel because again, Israel achieved a lot in this war. The text of Trump's 20-point plan is absolutely a victory from Israel, but the implementation has not been so far. And it seems harder and harder to imagine a reality in which Hamas is disarmed and pushed away from the scene. And now that this Board of Peace executive board is coming to light, it's hard to imagine that Turkey and Qatar are really going to be behind that as well.
Just to clarify, it was Netanyahu who said that Gideon Sar would be speaking with Marco Rubio, correct? And that's even more curious because, as I understand it, within the past week, our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has spoken, twice with U.S. President Donald Trump, as far as we know?
And he speaks with Rubio every couple of days as well. So it's absolutely a bizarre statement. On a very short statement that came out last night, the inclusion of Gideon Sar was absolutely came out of left field.
Curiouser and curiouser. All right, let's turn to Syria, where, again, the Kurds pop up. And according to what we're reading, Syria's army took control of swaths of the country's north over the weekend, dislodging Kurdish forces from territory over which they have held effective autonomy for over a decade. Shortly thereafter, the Syrian government issued a statement saying that it declares Kurdish a national language and grants the minority group some kind of official recognition. But Lazar, what do you know about what's happening in terms of the Kurds in Syria right now?
Yeah, so under the Assad regime, the Kurds were absolutely discriminated against in terms of taking away citizenship. They really had no, most of them had no real legal status within Syria, couldn't teach in their own language, even had many aspects of national expression outlawed. The new Shara government is trying to prove to the world that it is going to respect minority rights. Obviously, we've talked about the issues and the violence with the Druze minority closer to Israel, the Alawites, Christians, The Kurds are the best organized and best armed of these minorities. They've had a de facto autonomy in northeastern Syria for about a decade and have this effective armed force, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, which are mostly Kurdish. Now, there was an agreement in March 2025 under which the Kurds would become part of the Syrian National Armed Forces, but that has not been implemented. And this recent operation has been an attempt to say the deadline is up. If you don't agree to come under our rubric, then we are going to move into starting with Aleppo. And that's what we saw over the past week. And we've seen Syrian forces push beyond what they agreed to with the Kurds. The announcement on Friday that that Kurdish language and the Nowruz holiday would become Syrian national language and become Syrian national holiday was an attempt to calm down fear amongst the Kurds that they are being oppressed, that what they fear is actually taking place, that this Sunni majority force with a lot of jihadist backing is now moving against the Kurds. There's a lot of American attempts to mediate here because if this blows up, then there's going to be really no chance for a unified Syrian entity. And there will be no reason for the Kurds to ever trust their security to Damascus again. And that will obviously have implications for what the Druze are willing to do and maybe the Alawites as well. So a lot on the line here. Israel's kept pretty quiet about this, but we're certainly keeping an eye. You hear occasional statements from people like Gideon Sar about the need to protect Kurds. There's obviously a historic alliance with the Kurds, but that's mostly in Iraq. But certainly it's a minority people that has a lot of interest and sympathies that align with Israel. Turkey sees them as their big threat and their big enemy. So Turkey is certainly keeping a close eye and is potentially very deeply involved in what is going on in northern Syria along its border as well right now.
So at the same time, the Syrian president is meant to travel to Germany this week, I believe on Tuesday. He's meant to meet with Merz. And one of the topics up for discussion is the deportation of the Syrian refugees that found a place during the Assad regime when there was that terrible, terrible civil war and just millions were displaced. So this is really interesting to me, Lazar. It would be, I believe, the first country in Europe that would want to send back the refugees. What do you know about this?
Well, it wouldn't be the first country that wants to. It would be potentially the first country that does. Germany, Angela Merkel, the chancellor during the Syrian civil war, famously made a decision to allow 1 million Syrians into Germany. That, not surprisingly, has not gone over well politically in Germany and across Europe, especially Western Europe, because those are the countries where they thought it would be a good idea to open their doors to mass amounts of Syrian refugees. That's become a very hot political issue. A lot of anti-immigrant sentiment is driving European politics, as it is American politics right now. So there is. You haven't even heard this in Israel, that there is a rush to give legitimacy to the new Syrian government because once they say that Syria is safe and stable, then Europe can try to turn back the clock a bit and defuse this issue somewhat of the Syrian refugees and send them back to Syria. I'm sure a lot of them are not going to want to go. But that is certainly an accusation that these leaders are overlooking some of the dangers or some of the sins of this new government so that they can deal with their own domestic politics. But certainly Germany is the one where it is most potent because they took in 1 million Syrian refugees. But once they do, you might see it from other countries in Western and Northern Europe as well.
Okay, so stay tuned and we'll definitely have live blogs as they occur. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today and good luck to your, what was it, a soccer team?
Soccer, come on. Football, the New England Patriots.
I just wanted to give you another opportunity to show the helmet.
Yeah, there you go.
Lazar.
I'll be in a good mood tomorrow if they win. If not, don't talk to me for a few days.
All right, it's a deal. Lazar, thanks so much for joining me. And listeners, thank you so much for listening to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and Ari Shlach. If you have any questions or comments, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow. Shalom.